I'm going to try to leverage off Bella's great talk by not getting into the weeds of defining and explaining what ransomware is. I'll just say the whole ecosystem is quite complex, and Bella was largely talking about a branch or a strain of ransomware that is quite different to the activities of Conti, which is was a highly sophisticated ransomware criminal group, employing what's known as a ransomware as a service model. So they had a core group of actors and would develop malware and sell that as a service to a whole range of affiliates. We're looking at this through a criminological lens, and that's why I've got up there some description around other concepts related to serious and organised crime or transnational serious and organised crime. As a criminologist, we get caught up in quite technical levels of detail when we tease apart these concepts. Now, we have a particular meaning of organised crime that is quite different to how it's often used, certainly in political discourse and organised law enforcement activities as well. So by organised crime, we typically refer to these three sets of activities. Categories. So criminal activities, we're looking at highly complex integrated crimes that occur over a series of time. They are not simply crimes that are organised by groups who come together to do something and then disappear afterwards. Those activities need to be sufficiently serious for it to be considered organised crime. We look at the structure. We want to know and understand how these criminals are actually structured, and are they displaying a level of sophistication that is, again, commensurate with how we would expect organised criminals to operate. And then where we get really down to the weeds and argue amongst ourselves about what is and isn't organised crime is this concept of extra-legal governance. And that is, we distinguish between, say, an organised criminal group and a gang based on its capacity and intent to try to enforce and govern the markets in which it operates. So for a whole, say, 10 or 15 years, criminologists would argue about whether governance can take place in digital environments, because most organised crime groups govern or attempt to govern through violence or the threat of violence. And then we've got to start to think about what's the proxy for that and what does that actually mean in an online world. So we're looking at trying to take some of these concepts and apply it to a ransomware criminal group. And really today I'm focusing on structure. How is this group structured, and what are the different kind of tools that we've developed in other areas around organised crime research that can help us shed light on its level of organisation. The way I'm going to be talking about it today is through social network analysis, which is simply a methodological approach that really looks at the relationships between a set of actors, and we try to make sense of that in different ways. Every time I have to press this button twice, did you find that? So I gave a little bit of an overview about what Conti was. So it was a Russian-based ransomware criminal group employing a ransomware as a service model. It was active in around 2020 and disbanded around the middle of 2022. It was particularly famous in 2021 when it was identified as taking in ransom $180 million in visible transactions as identified through chain analysis in that year alone. So very few criminal groups get to achieve anywhere near that level of success. So really highly complex group. Is it an organised crime group? Is it a gang? Well, these are questions that we need to explore. And then what was particularly interesting is around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Conti publicly supported Russia and threatened Western states in particular that if they were to intervene in that conflict, that Conti would deploy its significant capabilities against them. So then, is it a criminal group that's financially motivated, or is it ideologically or politically motivated? So in other studies, we've looked at trying to understand Conti as a business, because this is really important to understand how these criminal groups come to that level of success so quickly. What kind of business models and practices are they employing? We've done that through using a range of theories in psychology and organisational psychology. So today I'm just going to focus on the role, structure and operations. I'm really trying to understand in this study, what are the different roles actors play and how does that translate to the structure of the group overall. I could talk about this for a very long time. I'm conscious I'm being filmed, but I'll try to be brief. So essentially, the data are quite interesting, quite complex. 160-odd thousand messages were leaked. We don't know who leaked that data. People speculate. There was a period in which the leaked data had been deleted, so it was likely someone was trying to protect their identity by doing so. 450 user accounts were associated with the different chat messages. So the user IDs operate in the same way that an eBay sort of marketplace would. We've separated the data into a whole series of time periods. We've tried a whole range of different time periods. And I should just note that almost all of it was in Russian. So that, in one sense, already poses some difficulties for the models that we're using. But then when you actually look at the contents of those chats and the way that people communicated, using highly technically sophisticated jargon and gibberish, was quite a challenge for us. So we employed a whole range of language processing techniques, and many of those, in fact, the majority didn't actually do what we wanted to do. So we resorted to a manual analysis to identify some of the roles that I'll talk about shortly. So in terms of some limitations, the data really difficult to interpret, and a lot of the kind of directed communication we were wanting to know who communicated with whom was not always able to be discerned for different reasons. Right. So the roles and structure. There's 16 different roles we were able to identify based on a manual read of the chat. So we had one person read a whole random sample of the communications by each user account of the 450. And in doing that, we tried to build a typology or a framework deductively from the data. Without actually coming up with the framework itself, we use the data to define the roles. Not expecting you to read all of those, but on the left hand, we have just administration and support, so a whole range of individuals or user accounts were associated directly with the administration of the group. Affiliates, so I mentioned at the start, there's a core and affiliate model. We wanted to identify who the affiliates were. There were people with dedicated responsibilities in and around campaign engineering, coders. So we distinguished between coders and developers on the basis that coders were managing the back-end operations of the ransomware criminal group, and the developers were actually designing, building and disseminating the malware to other members of the group, not in an offensive way. Hackers, there were a team deliberately tasked with hacking responsibilities. Human resources, there was a huge HR component to this group. It was quite a sophisticated operation. They had a designated payroll on the 1st and 15th of every month. Everybody got a set wage in Bitcoin transactions. They even had an employee of the month scheme. I'm not joking. They talked a lot about how they would support, recruit, train, career advancement opportunities. It was very interesting to liken it to a legitimate business. Had individuals responsible as negotiators, so they were negotiating with victims. Open source intelligence, there were two people in particular that were tasked with conducting all of the open source intelligence on victims or potential victims in and around what they could and couldn't pay. Do they have cyber insurance? What's the maximum threshold that they're able to pay under that insurance scheme? Operations support, so that's in a more offensive capacity. So the organisational leader, and this is where the portfolio manager and the senior managers, we distinguished on those bases because portfolio managers tended to have a specific field of work that they were responsible for, whereas senior managers were just a little bit broader in their responsibilities. Team leaders were identified directly from the chat, so we didn't actually have to label or identify who the team leaders were. They were referred to as such by other members of the group and were directed in directed communication to team leader. And the testers, so they would be responsible for testing all of the applications to make sure, or try to make sure that they bypass various security protocols and the like. So coders and testers were often interchangeable, or a person might have been a coder and a tester. There are a lot of people with dual roles in the group. And then for everybody else, we had this unassigned category. And the unassigned category for us just means we didn't have enough data sufficient to assign anybody a role. And that amounted to a huge number in terms of the user accounts. But when we assessed their influence and the extent to which they were active in the criminal group, it was actually quite low. So over 2/3 of the group we weren't able to assign roles for, but they were only responsible for less than 20% of the communications. So from that, we wanted to actually build a structure. So if this was how the reporting lines worked, which we were able to infer from the analysis of the chats, what is the structure of Conti? And this is what we came up with. It is, there's no accurate way to test this. The only real way would be for us to interview members of the Conti criminal group, send them this and get their feedback. At this point, that is not possible, but it might well be at some point in the future, so that remains to be seen. So the organisational leader, senior managers, HR, administration, portfolio managers, we distinguish between technical and operations. Really, the technical group was managing all of the systems, servers, networks of that group, designing, developing, testing malware. And the operations was on the offensive side, so who's getting targeted and how. We had numerous people occupy the roles of team leaders. So this is an organisational chart that doesn't correlate with individual user accounts. And affiliates are not listed on this structure because they're technically subcontractors to the group overall. But most of the affiliates communicated with either these two or the organisational leader, so they didn't have a lot of direct communication, suggesting that the affiliates were either known or recruited by those in senior positions. So then, once we built this structure, being a network analyst, we wanted to say, okay, well, this is how it works on an organisational company chart. All of the network research in pretty much every discipline, especially criminology, tells us that very rarely does it actually happen in the way that reflects the organisational chart. So we wanted to say who's actually communicating with who. Is it structured in this way? Is it actually a hierarchy, or is it more loose, flat, network kind of structure? So we did some heat maps of the communications, and we found that there's a significant amount of intra and interdepartmental communications. So in order to read this, you just look at the source department here, or unit, and who are they communicating with down here. So you can see the operations team communicated a lot with within the operations team. So they were functioning as a team. And you can see the technical people were communicating a lot with senior management, and senior management communicated a lot with them and a lot with themselves. So that's interesting. We did that just as an initial take to see, okay, well, is there something worth exploring into in more detail? So then we wanted to look at it from a role-specific perspective, and we saw, okay, who's driving most of the activity in this criminal group? And the first greatest amount of communications was happening from those in leadership and management positions. But interestingly, they were talking with everybody. So the organisational leader would communicate directly with new recruits. New recruits would go directly to the organisational leader, which would rarely happen in a business kind of environment. There were examples where a new person came in and said, I was told that I needed to speak to you about my salary, and from day one they would have that conversation and they'd have negotiate a performance bonus and so on then and there. So the operations team communicated a lot with themselves, so suggesting they had a lot of autonomy and agency in how they selected targets and how they would go about that. HR and administration, you get to see who are they communicating with and what is their communication about. And I mentioned about affiliates previously. So then what does a network perspective allow us to do when we want to explore this in more depth? So that is an overall single network map of the communications if we include every user account of Conti. So that's sort of how it looks, which clearly shows you just by looking at it, if you know nothing about networks, you can see that that doesn't really look like a hierarchy. It doesn't look at all like a hierarchy. The nodes are weighted by degree, which simply means the greater the size, the more the greater the level of communication. So we did have in the initial version that I got, I've been going back and forth with my postdoc on the data today. We had the labels on the map, but then when I looked at it, you just can't actually see it at all. That doesn't tell us much. So we wanted to go and look further and to say, well, we employed what's known as community detection analysis, which is a measure using modularity, which allows us to identify subgroups within the network. And a subgroup analysis is pretty important because it allows you then to break the overall network up into see, well, who are the more influential groups within that. There are a range of ways that you can do that, a range of software that you can use to do that. We've done these analysis using R and Network X. But essentially, when we look at the community detection analysis, it revealed 5 distinct communities. And the first one is, again, they're just color-coded here in order to sort of give you the bird's eye view perspective. I appreciate that's not a lot to look at. But you can see some people are quite active in the network in terms of the frequency of communications, but they don't occupy important positions, which in and of itself automatically tells us there's something interesting. But what we were able to identify using community detection is that we think we identified who the group were that started Conti and the core members that might have existed throughout its relatively short criminal career. But in the context of a ransomware criminal group, it's actually 2 years is a long time. Many of these groups might last. I think we did an analysis of something like 60 groups and found the median was 1.4. So that is a long time to be operating. So the community one, the large group, huge number of actors, comprised people from all over the organisation, which was interesting. It again wasn't showing any actual functional element. It was people communicating with everybody, coders, developers, testers, those in senior management, no affiliates, which was interesting. Community 2, though, we were able to start to see some actual patterns here. So they were those responsible for the back-end administration of the group. So they maintained all of its infrastructure and put out fires whenever they occurred. Frequent communication, again, between coders, developers and testers. Community 3, more offensive, so we're able to identify, and we do have the user IDs associated with each of these groups and actors. We're able to identify which cohort was more likely and active in terms of selecting targets and going after those. Community 4 and 5, we're still digging into a little bit more. So again, what it highlights is just the diversity of membership in these different communities. So showing that there's a lot of communication, most of that communication is very small and tactical, but showing coders are communicating with those that they want to develop, campaign engineers, the developers are responding to requests for support, and so on. So in terms of sort of trying to make some sense out of all of this, we believe initially there's a significant utility in connecting organised crime and cybercrime scholarship. Just some of the overarching concepts that have existed in the criminological literature for a long time might have utility when we compare other criminal network structures to those that are groups that are operating online. So Conti, in this case study, exhibited a highly structured internal boundaries. So it was designed with clear teams in mind. It did communicate internally and have a structure that resembled something like what we have presented. But in practice, those boundaries didn't actually mean anything. People were communicating about work functions in quite multidisciplinary team environments, suggesting not only a loose, flat structure, but what was most pertinent here is it's that kind of activity that allowed it to operate really efficiently. So it was able to solve problems quickly, it was responding to problems as they occurred, and giving staff agency to be creative, and that must have had a significant amount to do with its success, in and amongst other things as well. So the organisational leader, which has been identified as Stern, was highly central and active across a range of units and functions. As I mentioned, people would negotiate with Stern from the moment they walked in about their work conditions, and if Stern had a particular problem he wanted to solve, he would go directly to people at the lowest end of that group who he knew were best capable at doing whatever he wanted done. So there was no communication through hierarchical structures. Yet Stern did not govern Conti alone. We've identified here the significance of that middle and senior management group that operated at the senior manager and the portfolio manager level. And probably equally importantly, the role of HR in recruiting and onboarding new members. So in order to actually think about how we might prevent and disrupt their activities, identifying which actors have highly influential positions, based not only on their hierarchical position on the structure, more likely their position in a network, who's influential based on who are they communicating with. It could be coders and developers at that bottom end who have the high level of expertise and skills that are core to the functioning of that criminal group, and that they would be the ones that would be ideally targeted for disruption efforts. Yet in order to really get at those questions, we need to think much more creatively about multidisciplinary collaborations ourselves. And it's really, it's good to be thinking about this through a criminological lens, but ultimately, I think we need to be collaborating a lot more with computer scientists and data scientists to improve our understanding of not only the different roles that they have, but modelling, simulating some of these disruption techniques, which we can do in network analysis. You can remove people, you can remove users, and see the effects and predict the consequences. So I will leave it there. And thanks.